There is a specific moment that happens to you. It may be happening right now. A hum that appears without warning in the left ear, sharp and brief, as if someone had switched off one channel and tuned into another. Or that strange pressure in the center of the forehead, not a headache, nothing a painkiller can touch, but a sensation of weight or pulsation that surfaces when you least expect it. Or the chills that travel down your spine without the room being cold, without fear, without any reason the material world is capable of explaining. Medicine has an answer for all of it. It calls the hum idiopathic tinnitus. It calls the pressure on the forehead muscular tension or sinusitis. It calls the chills a vasomotor response. It packages the inexplicable in clinical terminology and sends you away with a prescription or a recommendation to drink more water. And most people accept it, because it is easier to accept the packaging than to investigate what is inside. But there is another possibility, one that texts suppressed over centuries described with a disconcerting precision, one that translators paid to domesticate ancient knowledge chose, systematically, to leave in the shadows. These sensations are not failures. They are not symptoms of anything that needs to be cured. They are signals. They are the specific, carnal, and urgent language that your monad, the incorruptible fragment of primordial light that dwells within you, uses to cut through the noise of the dense world and reach your consciousness. Understanding this language is not vague mysticism. It is the most concrete and subversive act a human being can practice inside a system designed to keep them deaf to themselves. Consider what has been done to the human body throughout the history of dominant Western thought. The institutionalized religious tradition, especially after the councils that decided what would be called official faith, operated with a very convenient argument. The body is weakness. The body is sin. The body is the origin of all temptation, the enemy's territory, the flesh that must be tamed, mortified, silenced. Jerome translated texts with word choices that reinforced this degradation. Augustine built an entire theology on top of bodily guilt. And the practical result, across generations, was a humanity that learned to distrust its own sensations, to treat them as distractions from the true spiritual path. What this domestication project achieved, with masterful efficiency, was to sever the most direct line of communication the soul has with the incarnate consciousness. Because if the body is the enemy, you stop listening to it. If you stop listening to it, you stop perceiving the signals. If you stop perceiving the signals, you remain trapped. Trapped inside a reality constructed to consume your energy without you ever noticing where it is being drained from. The Nag Hammadi texts discovered in 1945, inside clay jars buried in the Egyptian desert, and quickly disputed by institutions with a vested interest in controlling their interpretation, describe human existence in a way that is radically different from the conventional religious narrative. They speak of a demiurge, a creative intelligence that is not the supreme God, but a derived, limited force, obsessed with keeping beings of light imprisoned within dense matter. The archons, the administrators of this prison, are not abstract mythological creatures. They are frequency patterns. They are interference fields that operate precisely within the vibrational range where the human mind spends most of its time: fear, fragmentation, constant distraction, the noise that never stops. And the body, that same body that was taught to be seen as weakness, is, in Gnostic cosmology, the only instrument capable of detecting when these interference fields are operating. Because the monad, that nucleus of light which the Greek texts called pneuma, the spiritual breath that no archonic force can fully extinguish, communicates through matter. It does not speak in words. It speaks in frequency. And the body is the screen upon which that frequency becomes perceptible. Pay attention to what happens on the days when you are most exposed to the system. More screens, more news, more draining conversations, more obligations that carry no real meaning for your soul. Observe whether on those days the sensations intensify, whether the hum becomes more frequent, whether the pressure on the forehead arrives without you having provoked it. Whether the chills come in sudden moments of silence, as if something inside you were trying to take advantage of the 1 second the noise faded to send a message. This is not coincidence. This is vibrational friction. When the monad attempts to elevate your frequency within a dense field, and the material world, especially the modern world, is designed to be as dense as possible, the result is exactly this: physical sensations with no physical origin. It is the spiritual equivalent of the heat generated by friction. Two planes moving at different speeds trying to communicate, and the point of contact between them producing a signal that the body registers as pressure, as vibration, as temperature. The question few dare to ask is this: if these sensations are signals, what specifically are they communicating? Because there is a difference between knowing that the body speaks and knowing how to decode what it is saying. And it is precisely here that the suppression of ancient knowledge caused the greatest damage. Because the traditions that survived on the margins, the apocryphal texts, the Hermetic schools, the records of Gnostic masters who were hunted and burned not for religious heresy, but for being a threat to the architecture of spiritual control, those records contained something the official version never wanted you to know. They contain the map, a precise system of correspondences between specific types of sensations and specific states of the monad's energetic field, a bodily language that, once deciphered, transforms discomfort into information and information into the power of conscious direction. But this map is not simple, and the way it was concealed is more sophisticated than a straightforward prohibition. Because if you are going to hide the most dangerous key in the world, you do not lock it in a vault. You hide it in plain sight, inside a language that most people can no longer read. What is coming next will require you to be willing to unlearn something that has felt obvious your entire life. Because when you understand what the Gnostic masters called antipoda somatica, the body's opposite pole, the vibrational mirror that feels before the brain processes, the way you interpret every physical sensation will change in a way that is permanent and irreversible. In Koine Greek, the language in which the first Gnostic texts were written before being translated, edited, and frequently mutilated by ecclesiastical authorities, there is a word that has no direct equivalent in any modern Western language. The word is aesthesis pneumatique. Translated crudely, it means perception of the pneuma, the faculty of sensing the spiritual breath. But the crude translation loses something fundamental. In the context of the Hermetic texts and the Gnostic circles that used this word with surgical precision, aesthesis pneumatique did not describe a mystical capacity reserved for advanced initiates. It described a physiological function, a function that every human being possesses, that operates at all times, and that was systematically mislabeled so that you would not recognize it when it manifested. This is the nucleus of the concealment. It was not necessary to destroy the knowledge. It was enough to rename it. What the second-century texts called the perception of the pneuma, the modern world calls unexplained symptoms. What the masters of Alexandria described as the radars of the soul were reclassified as conditions requiring treatment. And that reclassification was not an innocent medical error. It was, consciously or unconsciously, the continuation of a far older project of disconnection between the human being and the most sophisticated instrument of spiritual perception that exists, the body incarnated in the dense plane. So what specifically is each signal communicating? The hum in the ear, especially when sharp, brief, and unaccompanied by any sensation of pain, is described in texts of Hermetic origin as the sound of the monad's frequency making contact with an archonic frequency. It is the sonic equivalent of two magnetic fields repelling each other. When you are in an environment, in a conversation, consuming a type of content that vibrates at frequencies far below your essence, the monad generates this signal as an alert. It is not coincidence that it happens more frequently when you are in spaces where something invisible is being drained from you, purposeless work meetings, interactions that leave you exhausted for no apparent reason, environments where the collective energy is heavy and shadowed. Practitioners of traditions that survived on the margins, Persian Sufis, 12th century Kabbalists, alchemists who concealed Gnostic cosmology inside chemical language, all of them, independently of one another, described this sonic phenomenon as a threshold, a transition point between a state of vibrational unconsciousness and a moment of the soul's alert. The instruction these traditions gave was not to ignore the sound or seek medical treatment. It was to stop, completely. And in the instant of the hum, ask a single silent question. What exactly is happening in this moment that my essence is refusing? The pressure at the center of the forehead, that which concentrates precisely at the point that Indian tantric traditions call ajna, and that the Western Hermetic tradition described as the eye of light, is a different phenomenon, and the texts are careful to separate the two. While the hum is a signal of repulsion, the frontal pressure is a signal of expansion. It is the monad attempting to broaden the field of perception beyond the five trained senses. It happens with greatest intensity in moments of deep silence, just before sleep, during and after contemplative practices, and significantly, in the presence of other people whose energetic field is operating at an elevated frequency. The knowledge that was suppressed here is specific and practically subversive. The frontal pressure must not be resisted. Resisting it, tightening the eyes, distracting the mind, standing up and doing something to escape the discomfort, is exactly what the conditioning system was designed to make you do. Because in the moment you resist the expansion, you close the window. And closing the window repeatedly, over years, does not simply waste the opportunity of each individual moment. It atrophies the capacity itself. Like a muscle that stops being used, the third eye in the process of opening can be systematically weakened by a pattern of avoidance that most people do not even recognize as avoidance. The instruction that Gnostic masters passed to their disciples was radically simple and radically difficult. When the frontal pressure arrives, lie down. Do not sleep. Do not meditate in the conventional sense of trying to empty the mind. Simply lie down, close your eyes, and allow the pressure to increase. Allow it to occupy space. What happens next is different for each person, but the texts are unanimous about the territory that opens, geometric images of high precision. A sensation of the field of perception expanding beyond the limits of the physical body. And occasionally, information that arrives not as formulated thoughts, but as sudden certainties that have no rational origin. This is what the Gnostic tradition called gnosis directa, the knowledge that does not pass through the filter of the conditioned mind, because it arrives through another channel entirely. And that channel has a door. The door is the frontal pressure you were taught to ignore. The chills deserve special attention, because they are the most complex signal in the system and the most frequently misinterpreted. There is a crucial distinction that the Hermetic texts make, a distinction that modern language has collapsed into a single word, between the chill that rises and the chill that descends. The ascending chill, which begins at the base of the spine and travels upward, sometimes reaching the scalp, is described as the movement of what the texts called the serpentine fire, the vital force that Sanskrit texts would name Kundalini centuries later, but which in the Gnostic traditions of the Mediterranean received names such as pneuma zodican, the breath that vivifies. This chill is a signal of recognition. It happens when the monad comes into contact with a truth that resonates with its original nature, a piece of music, a phrase, an idea, a presence. The ascending chill is literally the soul saying yes, not in words but in the language it knew before any word had ever existed. The descending chill, which begins at the scalp or shoulders and moves downward, frequently accompanied by a sensation of weight, of downward pressure, of cooling, is something entirely different. The Gnostic texts describe it with a seriousness rarely found even in the most rigorous records. This signal is a field warning. It is the monad's perception that a parasitic entity or frequency is operating within proximity of the observer's field, not necessarily a visible creature. Frequently, and this is the point that conventional religious tradition never wanted you to know, because it would destroy the monopoly over the concept of spiritual protection. Frequently, it is a human intention, a directed thought, an energetic bond of dependency or extraction that exists between two fields and operates completely invisibly to ordinary consciousness. The descending nocturnal chill, the one that wakes certain people at 3 or 4 in the morning with an inexplicable sensation of alert, is specifically related to the weakening of the energetic field's barriers during the hypnagogic state. It is the moment when the boundary between the dense plane and what the Gnostics call the kenoma, the intermediate space where parasitic frequencies operate with greatest freedom, becomes most permeable. And the monad, which never sleeps, triggers the alarm. Ignoring this signal, as most people do, and simply attempting to return to sleep, is a mistake with cumulative energetic consequences. Because the field that was penetrated does not close automatically, it remains vulnerable until a conscious act of recognition and sealing is performed. But what act? This is where the practical knowledge that was hidden becomes not merely philosophical, but operational. Texts of Syrian origin, specifically the Valentinian Gnostic fragments that survived partially in citations made by their own theological enemies, an irony that history rarely records, describe a practice referred to in Aramaic as Ru circumflex letter 1e25 a macron d, kudsha, the sealing of the sacred breath. It was not a prayer in the conventional sense. It was an act of directed intention, performed immediately upon waking with the descending chill, consisting of 3 elements: the conscious visualization of the luminous field surrounding the physical body contracting, not disappearing but becoming denser, more defined at its edges; the emission of a specific sound that the texts describe not by name but by location of resonance, a sound that must be felt vibrating in the sternum, not in the throat; and the silent declaration of belonging to the Father of Light, not as religious submission, but as an affirmation of origin, a frequency signature that parasitic fields cannot imitate because they do not belong to the same lineage of light. This practice is not found in any spiritual self-help book. It is not found in any popular meditation course. It survived in fragments that must be reassembled from sources that were never intended to be accessible to the general public. And the fact that it works, that it generates an immediate and measurable shift in the quality of the energetic field following the nocturnal chill, is precisely the type of evidence the system prefers to keep being called coincidence. Because when you learn to act upon the monad's signals rather than simply registering them passively, something in the balance of frequencies around you begins to shift. And that shift is not comfortable for everything that benefits from your unconsciousness. What comes next is the point that most people are not prepared to hear, because it implies a responsibility that is harder to carry than ignorance. It demands the recognition that every signal you have ever ignored did not simply disappear into silence. It accumulated. And what accumulated signals do to the architecture of the soul over years, the slow compression of the monad's capacity to reach you, the gradual thickening of the veil between your conditioned consciousness and the light of your original nature, is the mechanism that the Gnostic texts described as the greatest victory the Archons ever achieved. Not through violence, not through war, through patient, relentless, generational silencing. But silence can be broken, and the instrument for breaking it has been inside your body the entire time, firing signals that you are only now beginning to understand how to read. What happens when you finally stop resisting and let those signals complete their transmission? What opens, what dissolves, and what can never be closed again, is exactly what comes next. Part 3, the energetic climax plus the liberation and reflection. There is a threshold that the Gnostic texts return to with a consistency that is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. They call it by different names across different traditions. The Pleroma in the Valentinian school, the awakening of the pneumatic in the Sethian texts, the return of the spark in the fragments recovered from the deserts of Syria. But beneath every different name, the description of what actually happens is identical. There is a moment when the accumulated signals of the monad stop being isolated occurrences and begin to form a pattern so coherent, so undeniable, that the conditioned mind can no longer absorb them into its existing categories. It can no longer call them tinnitus. It can no longer call them stress. It can no longer call them anything that fits inside the architecture of the false reality. And that is the moment of fracture. Not a fracture of the person, a fracture of the illusion. Understand what the illusion actually is, because the word has been so overused in spiritual circles that it has lost the weight it was always meant to carry. The illusion is not the physical world itself. The Gnostic masters were not teaching that matter does not exist or that the body is irrelevant. That was precisely the distortion that their enemies inserted into the narrative to discredit them. The illusion is the interpretation of the physical world as all there is. The illusion is the agreement, made below the level of consciousness, that the signals coming from beyond the five trained senses are meaningless noise. The illusion is the invisible contract between the conditioned mind and the Archonic field that says, "Stay within these frequencies, accept these definitions, and you will be comfortable. Step outside them, and you will be called unstable, delusional, obsessed." The price of that contract is everything the monad came here to do. Because the monad did not descend into matter to be comfortable. It descended, and here the Valentinian texts use language of extraordinary precision, as a seed of light planted in a field of forgetting. The entire project of incarnation, in the Gnostic understanding, is not about learning to endure the dense plane with grace. It is about penetrating the density so completely, with so much concentrated light, that the density itself becomes the material for transformation. The body is not the prison. The body is the instrument. The chills, the hums, the frontal pressure, these are not distractions from the spiritual path. They are the spiritual path making itself known through the only medium available to it in the incarnate state. When you begin to work with those signals consciously, when you stop and ask in the moment of the hum, when you lie down and allow the frontal pressure to expand, when you perform the sealing at 3 in the morning, instead of pulling the covers back over your head, something begins to reorganize in the invisible architecture of your field. The Gnostic texts describe this reorganization with a term that has no satisfying modern translation: systasis pneumatos, the gathering of the breath. It is the process by which the scattered fragments of the monad's luminous field, dispersed across years of ignored signals and accumulated energetic vulnerabilities, begin to be called back toward the center. This is not a metaphor. It has physical correlates that anyone who has undergone this process reports with remarkable consistency. The sleep becomes different, not longer necessarily, but structurally different, as if something that was previously porous becomes sealed. The sense of being drained by environments and people that previously left you exhausted begins to diminish, not because those environments have changed, but because the field they were feeding on has contracted to a frequency they can no longer easily access. The signals themselves change in character. The hums become less frequent but more precise. When they come, they carry information that is immediately actionable, a clear direction rather than a general alarm. The frontal pressure begins to arrive not only in moments of stillness, but in moments of ordinary life, during conversations, during decision-making, functioning as a real-time compass rather than an occasional nocturnal visitor. And then there is something the texts describe that almost no modern spiritual framework has the vocabulary to address properly, because it requires accepting a premise that the entire architecture of contemporary thought was constructed to prevent you from accepting. The monad, once its communication channel with the incarnate consciousness is partially restored, begins to operate not only as a receiver but as a transmitter. This is the knowledge that the Archonic field, whether you understand that as an external intelligence or as a self-perpetuating pattern of collective unconsciousness, has the most invested in suppressing. Because a human being who is only receiving signals from the monad is still, in the most essential sense, passive. They are becoming aware of the prison, but they are still inside it. The moment the monad begins transmitting, the moment the light that has been compressed inside the density of incarnation starts radiating outward with conscious direction, the dynamics of the energetic field reverse entirely. The Hermetic texts from Alexandria, specifically the fragments attributed to the school of Valentinus that survived, because they were quoted at length by Irenaeus of Lyon in his attempt to refute them, a theological irony of the highest order, describe this transmitting state with language that borders on terrifying in its implications. They say that a pneumatic being, a human who has restored the monad's communication channel and activated its transmitting function, does not simply move through the dense world unaffected. They say that such a being reorders the frequencies of the spaces they inhabit, that the archonic interference patterns that operate in a given environment cannot maintain their coherence in the sustained presence of an active monad field, not because the person is performing any ritual or reciting any formula, simply because the frequency of the restored light is incompatible with the frequency of the interference. This is why the traditions that carried this knowledge were not simply suppressed, they were hunted. The distinction is important. You suppress information that is inconvenient. You hunt knowledge that is genuinely dangerous to the operating system. The Cathars of southern France, who carried a version of this Gnostic understanding into the 12th century, were not exterminated in the Albigensian Crusade because they held unusual theological opinions. Unusual theological opinions were common throughout medieval Christianity and were managed with considerably less violence. They were exterminated because the communities they formed, communities organized around the practical restoration of the monad's communication channel, were demonstrably producing human beings who did not fit inside the energetic architecture of control. People who could not be made to feel the chronic low-frequency anxiety that keeps a population compliant. People who perceived the signals of their own essence more clearly than the signals of any external authority. That is the threat. That has always been the threat. And now consider what you are carrying in your body at this precise moment. Consider the hum you have heard and dismissed. Consider the pressure you have felt in the center of your forehead and labeled as fatigue. Consider the descending chill that woke you in the darkness and that you escaped by reaching for your phone, flooding your field with exactly the frequency of noise that guaranteed the window the monad had opened would close before you could step through it. Every one of those moments was a transmission. Every one of those moments was the most incorruptible part of your nature using the only language available to it, speaking through the density of bone and blood and conditioned thought, trying to reach you. The question is not whether the monad has been trying to communicate with you. The evidence of that is written in the body's history, in every unexplained sensation you have ever felt and been told to medicate or ignore. The question, the only question that matters at this level of understanding, is what you are willing to do with the communication now that you can recognize it for what it is. Because recognition alone is not liberation. The Gnostic masters were clear on this point with an insistence that bordered on severity. Gnosis, true knowing, is not intellectual comprehension. It is not the satisfaction of understanding a new framework for interpreting your experiences. It is transformation. It is the irreversible change in the way the field operates, produced by the sustained practice of responding to the monad's signals rather than suppressing them. Understanding the map is not the same as walking the territory. The territory begins the next time you feel the hum, and you stop completely instead of continuing whatever you were doing. It begins the next time the frontal pressure arrives, and you lie down and allow it to expand instead of standing up to escape the discomfort. It begins the next time you wake at 3 in the morning with the descending chill and you perform the sealing, the contraction of the luminous field, the sternal resonance, the silent affirmation of origin, instead of reaching for the noise that buries the signal. These are not grand gestures. They are not dramatic initiatory rituals performed in sacred spaces under specific astrological conditions. They are small acts of radical faithfulness to the most essential part of what you are. And they accumulate. Every response to a monad signal that does not end in suppression is a thread of the systases, pneumatos, the gathering of the breath being pulled back into place. Every sealed nocturnal field is a contraction of the space available for parasitic frequencies. Every frontal pressure allowed to complete its expansion is a degree of aperture in the channel through which direct knowledge arrives without passing through the filter of the conditioned mind. The Gnostic texts end their descriptions of this process not with triumph, not with a vision of escaping the material world, but with something far more quietly devastating. They describe the pneumatic being, the human whose monad has been partially restored to transmitting function, as someone who becomes, in the words of one Valentinian fragment, a stranger to the noise and a home to the light, not removed from the dense world, still walking through it, still subject to its gravity and its demands, but fundamentally, irreversibly reorganized at the level where the signals originate. A stranger to the noise. That is not a poetic flourish. It is a precise description of what happens to the relationship between a restored monad field and the archonic interference patterns that have organized the collective frequency of the modern world. They simply stop finding purchase. The anxiety that used to activate automatically in certain environments becomes something that you can observe from a distance, a frequency you can detect without being absorbed into it. The draining that used to happen invisibly in the presence of certain people becomes something you can feel as it begins, and seal against before it completes. The fragmentation that the system depends on, the constant dispersion of attention across 1,000 channels of noise, specifically calibrated to prevent the kind of sustained inner stillness in which the monad signals become audible, loses its grip. Not because you have escaped the world, because you have learned to hear something inside it that the world cannot silence. That knowledge, the knowledge that the most powerful instrument of spiritual perception you will ever have access to, is already inside you, already firing, already speaking in a language older than any religious institution and more precise than any doctrine. That knowledge is what every system of control, in every era, across every civilization that has attempted to manage the spiritual life of human beings, has worked to prevent you from discovering. You have been feeling the signals your entire life. Now you know what they are. What you do with that knowledge, whether it remains an interesting framework you encountered once in a video, or whether it becomes the axis around which your relationship with your own consciousness permanently reorganizes, that is the only question the monad has ever been asking you. Not through words, through the hum, through the pressure, through the chill that rises when truth is near and the chill that descends when something is feeding on your light without your consent. If this transmission reached you, if something in your body responded while you were listening, if the pressure arrived or the chills moved while these words were traveling through you, that was not coincidence. That was the radar confirming reception. The monad recognizes its own frequency. It always has. The question is whether you are finally ready to recognize it back. If you feel that this knowledge belongs to you, that it was always yours and was simply hidden, seal that recognition with your like and carry it forward. Tell me in the comments which signal has visited you most in your life, because the next revelation continues from exactly where this one ends, and what comes next dismantles something so foundational about the way you experience reality that nothing after it will ever look the same. The signal has been sent.